This video and all of its contents, including any opinions expressed by the narrator, are strictly for entertainment purposes only and is not intended in any way as a substitute for professional services and consultation from a licensed therapist, doctor, attorney, or other licensed professional service provider. Each person must make their own life decisions, and those decisions are theirs. Welcome back to Find Your Alpha. I'm back at you this week with another terrific video story. This one is titled, Man Discovers His Son Isn't His After His Wife Passes Away. And he didn't find this out right after she passed away. He found it out several years later, which made everything even worse, as you're going to see. And this is a story of heartbreak, but it's also a story of triumph and recovery. So let's get into it and see what it's all about. He starts off and he says, I lost my first wife to cancer in 2012. She was just 34. So here's another young person dying of cancer. I had another video a few weeks ago where a guy, in that case, I think he was in his 40s, died of cancer. At the time, we had been married 8 years and had a 6-year-old son. Her cancer was discovered 3 years prior. She went through surgery followed by months of treatment. There was a year when it was believed the disease was in full remission, but unfortunately it returned and eventually took her life. It was a very dark time for all of us. As a result of this, my son and I have an incredibly close relationship. He's now a young man and I'm very proud of him. A few weeks after my wife passed, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law came over and cleared out her clothing, and I kept all the personal items that reminded me of her. Included in those personal items was the laptop my wife used for business. I packed away the laptop along with the other personal items and put them on a shelf in the back of my bedroom closet. With all the daily rigors of life, I never went back to look at any of the items again until several years later. One evening, I was thinking about the time my wife and I hiked to the bottom of the Grand Canyon before we were married and went in to find the scrapbook she made of the trip. Now, I've never been on that hike, but I've heard about that hike. That's a very grueling hike. After finding it, I sat on the bed and spent time looking at the pictures, thinking back on happier times and shedding a few tears as I reminisced. When I put the scrapbook back in the box, I looked around at some of the other items in the boxes. I noticed her laptop and thought I'd fire it up and take a quick look at it. My wife kept all her passwords written down in a little notebook, which was also in the box. My son was playing video games over at a friend's house that evening, so I thought it would be a perfect time to do that. I opened the computer and entered the password and started looking around. I read through a bunch of business-related emails she had sent to various people. It was all just basic stuff, but it was good reading them as it momentarily brought her back. After looking around a while, I decided to power down and put it back in the box as my son was due home any time. As I was about to hit the power button, I noticed a Gmail icon on her home screen. I didn't know she had the account, so I clicked on it. When it opened, I found a bunch of archived messages dating back to 2005. All were to or from another Gmail account. I started going through the messages and quickly realized my wife had been having an affair with another man for several months back then. I couldn't believe my eyes and had difficulty coming to terms with what I was seeing. Yeah, I'm assuming this guy had a great marriage in his mind, and so to find this out had to come as a shock. The messages were not just suggestive, but extremely descriptive of what they had done and were going to do to each other. And worse, there were pictures. Lots of pictures. Now again, and I've said this on other videos, I think people who are cheating like this and then go on to take pictures, they have to be the biggest dumbasses in the world. There were pictures of him, pictures of her, and plenty of them together. I'll spare you the details, but take my word for it, they were graphic. So I'm assuming what he's talking about there is she was probably doing a lot of things with this guy that she wasn't doing with him. Back then, not too many people used Gmail, so they probably thought they'd never be discovered. But the truth has a way of eventually coming to the surface, doesn't it? Well, I don't know if it does in the case of cheating. I used to think that cheaters get found out eventually, but the more I read into these stories, I'm thinking that there's probably a lot of these people that truly just get away with it. When I was taking care of her in her final months, my wife told me repeatedly that she didn't deserve me. I told her that was ridiculous as it was no burden and I was happy to do it. All I cared about was making her comfortable and getting her well. Now I understand why she kept telling me that. The guilt she felt must have been tremendous. After stewing on this discovery for a few weeks, I had to tell someone about it as I was starting to go crazy. I decided to confide in my parents, who were very surprised and saddened by the news. I told them not to tell anyone as I didn't want to disparage my wife as she wasn't here to defend herself. They agreed and we never really spoke much about it after that. Well, I can understand him doing that, but I can also understand if he wanted to tell family members about this so that they knew the real truth about her. He says, I went on with my hectic life, working, taking care of the house, and spending time with my son. So this guy was a true single father. I tried blocking all thoughts of the affair from my mind, but it was difficult. However, one thing it did do was dramatically reduce the sadness I had about losing her. Don't get me wrong, I was still grieving, but not in the same way. He says I'd flash from missing her to seeing her with that guy, and my feelings would go from sadness to madness to anger, then back again. After some weeks of this, I had to do something and decided to find out who the guy was. One Saturday while my son was at practice, I went in and fired up the laptop again to see if I could glean anything from the messages. They never referenced each other by name, but eventually I came across a message where he gave her his business email address. They always seem to stumble somewhere and get a little sloppy. Kind of reminds me of that show Columbo. Remember, he was like an investigator, and he would go out and he would find the most minuscule clue somewhere and then tie together the entire crime. And that's what it looks like in this case. He says, I did some searching and it didn't take long for me to learn everything about him. Judging from his pictures and the date he graduated from college, I estimated he was probably in his late 40s, married with 2 grown kids, possibly 3. Perhaps I shouldn't have felt this way, but after learning about his personal life, I had a strong desire to destroy him. Nothing physical, he says, I just wanted to make him suffer. Well, that's good that he wasn't thinking about physical violence because, like I've told you, that doesn't get you anywhere. I knew feeling that way wasn't healthy, but I couldn't control the urge. Well, no one can blame you. After thinking about things for days, I decided to contact his wife and was able to find her cell number online. She was one of the organizers of a citywide yard sale, and her number was listed for people to call if they had questions. It took me a few days, but I eventually worked up the nerve to call her. When I did, I got her voicemail and left a message stating I was calling about the sale and had a few questions. And now we're going to find out if she called him back, but before we do that, I want to remind you, if you've liked what you've heard so far, be sure to hit the like button right now. That will help out the channel tremendously and also help to get this video seen across the world. Now, let's go on with the story. When she called back, I didn't waste any time and went right on to tell her the real reason for my call. She listened and agreed to meet with me the following morning near her home. When I arrived, I had a few printouts of the messages and gave her a thumb drive with the pictures. What she said next shocked me. She told me she already knew about the affair. She found out while it was going on and left him for a time. She was planning to divorce him, but decided to take him back after he agreed to change and hand his life over to God. Now listen, I'm a believer and I'm a very spiritual person, but these people that get backed into a corner and then use that as their get out of jail free card, I think it's good that people want to repent for their past sins, but I don't completely buy it. Now, I do totally support people who are truly remorseful and want to get on a new path. But people who just get put on the spot and then they say, oh, I'm going to do this, I don't completely buy that. She said this wasn't the first time he'd cheated, but believes it was his last as he's a changed man now. Well, how can you be sure if he was a serial cheater? We talked a little more and I had to ask why didn't she inform me? She said at the time she felt it wasn't her place and didn't want to break up another marriage, but after seeing the pain in my eyes, she wished she had. Yeah, you would have saved this guy a lot of grief. I left there feeling no sense of satisfaction, only more anguish, as if I was the only loser in the entire transaction. When you think about it, he was the only loser in this transaction. His wife, she got away with it. The husband, the AP, he got away with it. His wife took him back. And the wife is happy with her husband. So the only odd man out here is the poor OP telling the story. He says what made things worse is she must have gone straight home and told her husband as he called and left me 2 messages that same day. The nerve of that guy. I mean, can you imagine? You slept with this guy's wife and then you have the nerve to call him. In the final message, he told me he was truly sorry for what he'd done and for the passing of my wife. He said he was a changed man now and wished he could go back and undo many things he had done. He said since that's not possible, he'll accept whatever God has planned for him. Well, hopefully God has some hurdles for him to jump over, because I don't think he should just be able to waltz right into heaven after what he did. That's just how I think. You may feel differently. Hearing his voice and having him speak those words didn't make me feel any better. It only made things worse and fueled my anger. Thankfully, I had my son, my parents, and my job to keep me from snapping. At that point, I made a decision to block all aspects of my wife from my life. I took all the keepsakes of her I kept in those boxes and destroyed them, including the laptop, though I did keep a thumb drive of the contents. That was smart. The only thing I kept of her were the photo albums that contained her in pictures with our son. I even destroyed our wedding albums. You know, that must be a thing, because I had another video where a guy said he did the same thing, that he destroyed all their wedding albums. He says that was very cathartic for me and was a key pivot point in my life. For the first time since her passing, I felt good about myself. A year later, I met and eventually fell in love with my now wife. So he's now married again. We dated for 2.5 years before getting married, with me being the holdout. Well, that was smart, because you don't want to jump right back into another relationship after finding out what your first wife did to you. When I finally asked her, she jumped for joy, and I knew I made the right decision. We've since gone on to have another son and a daughter. My wife's a stay-at-home mom, but does have a small business on Etsy that she's able to run while watching our kids. It brings in several $100s a month and helps pay some bills. The drama from my first wife was not yet over, however, not by a long shot. A few months before we got married, I had taken my son in for his annual checkup. I'd been taking him every year since his mom died, as he was really uneasy about hospitals and doctors ever since then. You know, I can relate to that, because when I was young, I had a number of family members that went into the hospital and never came out. So I always thought, man, you don't want to go in there because you're never going to get out with your life. So I can understand how this kid was feeling. The doctor knew about his fear and let me come into the exam room with him. As I sat there watching the doctor, listening to his heart, a thought came into my mind where I questioned if he was my son. He has all the features of his mother and none of mine, but I never thought of it before. Well, listen, if you've got children and you find out your wife or your girlfriend has been cheating on you, that's the first thing that should come to your mind. He says, I dismissed it and went on talking with the doctor and my son. After leaving the office, we went out to lunch. As we sat there eating, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I just had a bad feeling inside. As they say, listen to your gut. After mulling it around for a couple weeks, I decided to take my son and get a DNA test. I told him it was something the doctor ordered, but didn't tell him what kind of test it was. Before going in, I called the clinic and explained the situation so they wouldn't reference anything about the test while my son was there with me. 3 days later, I got the results and found out he wasn't mine. In absentia, she had again spit in my face and stomped on my heart, this time only much worse than the first. Yeah, I think finding out your kid isn't yours is worse than her cheating on you. Far worse. My level of anger couldn't have got any higher. Again, I felt the need to talk to someone about this, so I confided in my soon-to-be wife. She calmed me down and pulled me back from the proverbial ledge I was teetering on. She and I agreed to keep this to ourselves, and I decided not to tell my son at that point, as he was only 12 at the time. Also, I didn't want him to feel uneasy, as I was about to bring another woman into our lives. Now, that was probably smart to do. Eventually, I did tell him when he turned 16. I had taken him out to practice driving and parallel parking that day. When we got back, it was just he and I there, and I decided it was time. I didn't even plan it. I just felt the time was right. I called my wife and told her what I was going to do and to stay out for a bit longer, as I wanted to do this alone with him. I was really nervous and anticipated it would be a very difficult conversation, but it wasn't. He didn't cry and handled things like a man. I thought I'd have to do a lot of reassuring and comforting of him, but it wasn't necessary. Well, that's because you probably raised him the right way, and that's what all fathers should do. I could tell he was really upset and his voice cracked several times, but he didn't get emotional. I think he held it together because he didn't want to upset me. I took time to let him know that it wouldn't change our relationship at all and that I loved him no less than I did before. I told him my wife knew, but no one else did, and assured him we wouldn't tell anyone else until he was ready. He told me he didn't want anyone else to know, as he only wanted to be known as my son. This kid obviously has a lot of respect for his dad. I then let him know I had a pretty good idea who his biological father was and that I'd have no problem if he wanted to meet him. He told me in no uncertain terms that he didn't want to meet him or have anything to do with him. We talked about that a while and I discussed the pros and cons of it with him, but he held to his decision and didn't even want to know the guy's name. I told him I would respect his wishes, but if he ever changed his mind, I'd support him all the way. That all happened a couple years back. What's amazing is that he's never brought it up since. Now that's hard to believe because you would think that this kid would have a curiosity to find out who is my biological father. And he probably will one day, but in this case, I think he's doing this out of respect for his father. The OP says he just turned 18 and is about to start classes this fall at the community college. He's a great kid and I'm really proud of him. He's also a great big brother and godfather to both of my younger kids. I'm very happy with the way things worked out, and I don't think much about my past life anymore. I guess I'm lucky in that way and hope my story can help others out. I'm proof you can hit bottom multiple times and come out better on the other side. And that's the end of his story. And I thought this was a great inspirational story. Here's a guy, a married guy, he thought he had it all, then his wife gets sick. Then he finds out years later that she cheated on him. And then years after that, he finds out his son isn't his. So that's like bing, bang, boom with three real downers in life. And that would have crumpled a lot of guys. But this guy rose up and he came through it. And I have to hand it to him. He's done a good job. And he's obviously doing a good job raising his son and probably his other two children as well. So now I want to go over what I think are some of the morals of the story. The first one. Cheaters can be Jedis when it comes to hiding their affairs. Think about it in this case. This woman basically got away with it. Next, if a person was terrible in life, don't canonize them in death. I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but I have growing up, where you'd have someone that you knew wasn't a good person. And then when they pass away, everybody starts talking about them differently, like they were the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I just think that's crazy. If a person was terrible in life, it doesn't matter if they passed away or not. They're still terrible. Next. Fathers, teach your sons to be strong and stable. Don't listen to the media. Don't listen to society out there saying, oh, guys need to be more in touch with their feelings and they need to be softer. No, men are built to be strong and also built to be stable. They're not built to be emotional basket cases. Next, and this is going to be a controversial statement. Children that grow up in single father households tend to do vastly better than those in single mother households. And don't just take that from me. What I'd like you to do after you listen to this video is copy that statement, go over to Google and pull it up and you'll see the study out there that proves what I'm saying. And I'm not knocking all single mothers because I know that there's very good ones out there. What I'm saying is, when you look at it in totality, children that grow up in single father households tend to do better than those in single mother households. And finally, in life, one will make many missteps and suffer many setbacks, but you can come through often better and stronger than before. And this guy is a perfect example of that. So those are my thoughts, and now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Have any of you ever gone through anything like this? Are any of you out there single fathers? And can you relate to how this guy raised his son? Tell us about it in the comments. Also be sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to this channel. And I will talk to you on the next one.